Right, I will now introduce the poetry panel. First, we have Melanie Benson Taylor. Melanie Benson Taylor is an associate professor of Native American Studies at Dartmouth College. She is the author of Disturbing Calculations, The Economics of Identity in Post-Colonial Southern Literature, 1912 to 2002, and Reconstructing the Native South, American Indian Literature and the Lost Cause. She recently edited the Cambridge History of Native American Literature and is currently completing a monograph entitled Doom and Deliverance, The Indigenous Ends of Southern Fiction. And I'm going to have her come up now and tell us about the poem that she has read for the panel.
Okay. I'd ask if you can hear me, but I think the real issue is whether you can see me. That joke never gets old because I never get taller. If you can't hear me, just wave wildly back there. So I'm going to take one of my precious 5 minutes to read the poem. I think it's time well spent, better given over to TC than to me. So this is Mother Pickin' Cotton. If you try hard enough and get put down enough by those affluent paupers with America stamped on their palms, you might just be like Horatio Alger or Rockefeller or some other feller immigrant with no feeling for your time or my time or their time. Let's see your handfuls in your own self on the older picture books, sketches of time and handfuls and empty hands that are hot in the socks. And Mom, she's hot and tired, but she's a good mother, and she's the mother of all times, and no hands hold more than hers. She's a queen of yourself and myself, and she's toiled hard for some things. This thing we find when we grow deathly close to sleep and warmness, this thing is something, that mother is herself, this handful of herself, and your time and mine she gives, and asks only for rest when she's tired. I love her most for herself. My mama goes to sleep, tired. Okay. So, I wanted to talk about this poem today because I still have no idea what to say about it. When I received the assignment from Karen to write an essay for the catalog on the TC Canon exhibition, this is the poem that struck me most immediately and personally, and yet I never found a way to address it in my essay. So it seemed like the obvious, if somewhat terrifying, choice for today's exercise. What was it about this poem that so arrested and stymied me? The motif of picking cotton registers first and foremost as the bedrock of the Southern plantation economy. And as a scholar of Southern literature primarily, I always get excited when I see typically Southern themes in Native writing, because so much of my work has been devoted to exploring the uncanny echoes between these parallel lost causes. We might easily see Cannon stylizing himself here as modernity's half-emancipated slave, chained to a socioeconomic order both seductive and alienating. The motif of hands throughout captures the literal slipperiness of America's dissembling logics of possession, the air-quoted frail Americanness stamped on the palms, the place where it's most likely to be rubbed away, and marking colonial capitalist success stories like Horatio Alger's or Rockefeller's, one fictional and one real, and yet importantly the same. Both are equally aspirations of the you and the I of the poem. Cannon purposefully collapses all of these discrete subject positions, you and me, slave and free, Indian and American, the affluent and the pauper. He was smart and cynical enough to know that the 5 civilized tribes brought the cotton economy with them to Oklahoma out of the Southeast, not as slaves, but often as slave owners. The grasping principles of American success stain all of our hands, he implies, indigenous and otherwise, but those handfuls of plenty are sardonic desires. Let's see your handfuls. And it's only empty hands that finally pluck those stalks, the great irony, of course, of the working class. But it was really the poem's central gravity of the mother figure that affected me most deeply. First, by making me think of my own mother, who worked herself physically to the bone in order to give my sister and me our own bootstraps. While my unbearable privilege of doing mostly perspirationless work makes me embarrassed to go home again, Cannon brilliantly invokes the ineffable thing that tethers us to the people and the places and the pain and toil that made us, that remind us of our barrenness even and especially in the face of abundance. Here the mother is a tantalizing decoy. No hands hold more than hers. What we seek to possess finally is ourselves, to be held and comforted and made whole. This idea moved me deeply, not just as a daughter, but also as a mother. I was pregnant with our second child, who's back there now in the flesh, when I began reading and writing about canon, wondering about the ways I might, in turn, guard my boys against the awful hungers, the hollowness of being in this world. I continue to be affected by canon's closing image of the mother as anchor, as a reorienting space of warmth and fullness in a world that otherwise consumes. But I don't leave the poem reassured. The mother goes to sleep tired, after all, emphasis on that final word, tired, which gets the last line all to itself. And boy, do I know that feeling. Perhaps the most dangerous way, though, to misread this poem, finally, is by conflating the economic and ecological parable with the domestic one. That is, to see the mother as a reification of Mother Earth, the land itself that endures and holds us before and after the dissembling operations of settlement and materialism. This is an especially seductive metaphor now that the buzzword or buzz concept of the Anthropocene has us all confronting the ways that the human handprint has permanently stamped our world. Within these conversations, indigenous knowledge and values are invoked repeatedly as a kind of antidote to apocalypse. But this poem warns against such simplistic maneuvers. And this is what most epitomizes canon's work writ large, I think, both written and visual, the reminder that we are all agents of modernity, not relics of antiquity. And as such, we are complex collisions of traditional values and colonial capitalist aspirations. We are both slave and free. We are our own masters and prisoners all at once. And we are, for better or worse, the shapes our composite mothers made and toiled for, the progeny of both ecological and economic forces, both empty and full, but always and finally tired, an expression of an aboriginal emptiness that won't and can't be repaired by the false promises of either capitalism or indigeneity.
All right, thank you. So the next person I have on my list is William S. Yellow Robe Jr. Yeah, he's here. Oh, who's next on the slide order? So next is Matt then? I apologize. All right, I apologize for that. Matt Hooley is next. I can find him. There we go. Matt Hooley writes and teaches at the intersection of indigenous, colonialism, and environmental studies. Recent essays he's published have situated the decolonial poetics of writers including D.G. Nanook Okpik and Sherwin Bitsui as generatively antagonistic to the protocols of settler environmentalism. He's currently working on 2 book projects, one that theorizes the decolonial native modernism through the indigenous literary history of Minneapolis, and another that's a comparative study of the coloniality of drought in Palestine and the Deneta.
I'm about to talk about attachment, so I should add an extra 30 seconds to say that I'm really happy to be attached with you guys right now. And thank you to Karen for doing this and making all of these affects possible, and also to Rachel. It's really extraordinary and humbling to be here. So I'm going to talk about a poem called Collector Number 3, which is here. But I'm actually going to start with a different poem, which you might see upstairs, called When I Die, which is a poem that seems to eerily predict Canon's early death, but it's also one that suggests an animating contradiction in his work, which is the way that attachment always occurs alongside absence, that we make our worlds by gathering and holding people and land and ideas alongside the loss of what makes those worlds feel whole. So in that poem, When I Die, Canon writes, "All I know is that you, my friends, will be far away when I die. I will be in the desert, and you will be in the city when I die." That poem spatializes the inevitability of absence with which we nonetheless compose our worlds. This is a political and aesthetic contradiction, and also for us today, as we gather in the city, it's an occasional contradiction made by the irrefutable presence of this collection upstairs and the now almost exactly 40 years old absence of its maker. So the collector in this poem, collector number 3, the word refers to a set of paintings, collector 2, 3, and 5, which is kind of like wonderfully absented by the missing collector number 4. All the paintings depict figures set in a room in front of other paintings. In 2 and 5, the paintings are Van Gogh landscapes. And in 3, the one that corresponds with this poem, the painting is Cannon's, or print, actually. For an artist ambivalent about the commodification of native art, and the idea of collecting or collection might suggest acquisition, the coloniality of the way that native art obtains value as it's dispossessed from tribal, political, and interpretive economies. But these dynamics are complicated in the series of paintings in which the figures are native and 2 of the paintings are not native, and the affect of the series in general suggests a very different kind of relation, not acquisition but intimacy, the tension of proximity, not paintings held but people and space held together tenuously in a moment. More volatile and fleeting than postures of property, the meaning of collection in these paintings is unmoored into its cognates, recollection, collection as accrual or visiting. To collect is to be consumed by the fragility of what Walter Benjamin calls the sense of having. It's tactile, an interest in what is transformed by closeness. Collecting here is not transactional but mutual. There's no touching without being touched. The collector is not the one who transcends, but who is collected, who collects themselves in relationship to things again and again as the collection gathers or atrophies. Thus, the collector is the one, when they die, that also lasts or endures by becoming identical with the collection itself. Upstairs, this is Cannon's collection. It's how he lingers both with and beyond us. So collector number 3 is the only poem paired with one of the collector paintings, I think. And that pair seems kind of isolated from the other paintings by its biographical and erotic interest, which you can see upstairs, and also it was projected earlier today. The poem's subtitled Elizabeth, as you can see, after the painting's subject, who is reclined holding a heart. So we're given to read these as describing the quality or form of a relationship, one that's ended but not over. However, form in this poem is not just mimetic. It's a poem about form, about the erotics of formal relations in general, of collection, that connects it back with the rest of the series. So this poem, as you read it, which I don't have time to do, seems cubist. Its couplets are angles rearranged around repetitions of there is, you can see in stanzas 1, 3, 5, and 7, and then at odds with in stanzas 2, 4, and 6. These angles track familiar cubist interests in frustrated location or coherence, but they're not just disjunct. What's produced isn't a disjointed bourgeois interior. At odds with isn't a crisis, but the terms of transformation and invention. Rather than a lament about love lost, the poem considers the shape of loss itself, what loss does to relation, what loss makes. The sound loss makes in this poem isn't broken or discordant, but as you see at the end, is humming. Where the angles of eros, location, and coherence fail to meet are absences that are humming, such that where the form of the poem breaks, and you can see that after the first 4 stanzas, it instantly recombines. Out of these odd couplets blooms this exuberant, imbalanced quintet. So it's terrible that upstairs, that this is all we have of Cannon's work, that his collection is finished. But at the same time, this poem insists that any such assessment, which is necessarily informal, ignores the way that absence is always affecting. Cannon shows us that we connect or disconnect with forms not before or after, but always in the midst of loss, and that we misunderstand loss if we forget that it's always humming. if we can't sense that its terribleness, is always also the precondition of its presence for us here in the city where we recollect ourselves with it. Thanks.
All right, up next we have Dorothy Wang. Dorothy Wang is a professor in the American Studies program at Williams College. Her monograph, Thinking Its Presence, Form, Race, and Subjectivity in Contemporary Asian American Poetry, was chosen as one of the New Yorker's the books we loved in 2016. The first National Conference on Race and Creative Writing was named after the book and held in 2014, 2015, and 2017. Wang's work focuses on the issue of race and 20th and 21st century English language poetry and poetics, particularly experimental minority poetry. She also conceived of and co-founded the Race and Poetry and Poetics in the UK working group based in the UK.
Thank you, Matt, and thank you, Karen and Rachel, for putting this event together and curating the exhibit and making this all possible. I also want to acknowledge the Namkheg and Wampanoag people. So I work on experimental minority poetry, as Matt says, but I was struck today by the talks on art history and art and a lot of the similarities around issues that have to do with thinking about aesthetics and politics in both art history and in poetry. So I'm going to speak a little bit more informally, but I'm going to speak sort of macro and micro. The poem I chose, for those of you who had a chance to look at the poems, is Mama and Papa Got the Shiprock Blues. But I'm going to say first a few words before I dive into the poem about sort of larger issues that I think have been mentioned by people like Janet and Dan and Austin and Rachel this morning, and also by Karen, touched on some sort of macro issues, which is, I think for minority artists and poets, and T.C. Cannon happens to embody both, he's both a visual artist and a poet, they face a lot of assumptions and biases that people bring to the reception of their work and the reading of their work, whether it's a painting or a poem. And I think we're familiar probably with some of these, which is this opposition, say, between form and content, thinking about minority work primarily in terms of thematics and content. This often happens in the poems, but also in the artwork. The opposition between the so-called minority artist and the real artist, or the artist that is unmarked, as if that were possible. And the kind of, I think, idea of identity politics as a dirty word, or of identity as a dirty word, because it somehow limits the universal or transcendent artist. So I really question those binaries, and I question those assumptions. And of course, I think about the imbrication actually of history and form that has been a fact of all American and actually all painting and all poetry. I mean, we like to think of poetry as being very personal and very separate from the world, but it's always a product of someone who is a person situated in history and in society. So I picked this poem, Mama and Papa Got the Shiprock Blues, which also echoes the painting that Karen talked about this morning called Mama and Papa Got the Coming Home Shiprock Blues. And I don't have time to read the whole thing, but maybe we can look quickly at the first stanza. Well, I've been out there where the VC stay. I write home most every day. It don't seem to ease my pain at all, because I long for the sand and the pinon trees, sheep manure up to my knees, and in the evening time, my greasy Joe babe squab. Oh, Mama, Papa's got those blues again. Oh, Mama, Papa's got the Shiprock Blues again. So one reason I chose this poem is because I was really interested in the references to the Vietnam War, the poems that talked about the Vietnam War, because it seems to me that that the Vietnam War is a kind of nodal point which brings together this link between a history of colonialism that actually has been perpetrated against obviously indigenous peoples, but against Asians in Asia. And we think of the various wars, like the US-Philippines War, World War II. Janet talked about the mushroom cloud, Hiroshima, Nagasaki, the Korean War, the Vietnam War, and also the crimes and violence that have been perpetrated against African Americans. And it seems to me that Vietnam, and we know that was such a formative event for canon, the reference to the VC in that first line, I think is really, really important here because it actually links these kinds of histories together. And I'm interested in formally in obviously the repetition of that refrain, which is like a song refrain. Oh, mama, papa's got those blues again. Oh, mama, papa's got those shiprock blues again. But that repetition of the oh at the beginning of several lines, oh, 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 which technically, the technical term for that when you have a repetition at the beginning of a line is anaphora. And the poet Walt Whitman makes a lot of use of anaphora, which is that repetition at the beginning of the line. So I'm really interested in how that repetition works. And I'm thinking also to Karen's discussion of the painting that had the repetition of the figures, but they were changed slightly. And there are very subtle changes here where you've got those blues and you've got the blues. And of course, for me, automatically, when I think of the blues, I think obviously of the African American tradition. So you've got that working here. The other thing I'll just say, because I don't want to, I think I'm out of time, is the other thing I'm interested in formally, again, that links the formal issue in the poem to larger issues, is the use of pronouns. I'm always fascinated by pronouns. So I'm interested, for example, in that third stanza. Let me ride on horse the dreams. They got someone in there that are the most sentimental and say, well, they feed you twister and they steal your rings, homemade rugs and various things. I had a Wallapai friend who lost his G-string too. So who's the I here? Who's the you? Who's the they? And I think that's really important in terms of the point of view of the speaker of the poem. And also when we think back to the paintings, from whose point of view is that world being represented or depicted? And traditionally, as has been brought up this morning in the talks, the presumed point of view has usually been the white male artist and their view of the world. And as many of the speakers brought up this morning, that the minority artist is the peripheral or the accessory. And that's true in poetry too. So the presumed kind of universal I in most poems, it's presumed to be unmarked and universal and abstract, but actually it is marked and classed and gendered. So here I'm very interested in his use of the pronouns here and what is that relation between the me, the they, and the you. So I think that's an instance where you see a formal issue that's actually very much tied to a much bigger issue about the position people have and the issue of power in the world. And so that's all I have to say.
Right. Up next, we have Santee Frazier. If I can find him. And I don't have a bio in here for him. Right. Santee Frazier is a graduate of the Institute of American Indian Art and received his Master's of Fine Arts degree from Syracuse University. Frazier's most recent poetry collection is Dark 30. He teaches in the low-residency Master of Fine Arts in Creative Writing program at IAIA. Santee contributed to some tremendous poetry to the TC Canon at the Edge of America publication in response to Canon's work. It's a great pleasure to have him here.
right, so complete different hat I'm wearing now. I'm not reading poems. But I prepared a few remarks for this particular talk. Usually I do this sort of as a technician, like you would see like in maybe a poetry workshop or something like that, where I'm talking about trochees and dactyls and all these other things. But I'll save you from that today, and I'll kind of talk from more of a conceptual point of view, because I was really interested in the way that T.C. Cannon kind of uses the poetic form to kind of slice through, and kind of to quote Karen here, to slice through this sort of binary, right? And she kind of mentioned this sort of aversion to binary, and I'm really interested in that in poetry, because I feel like that's the sort of essence of poetry, is to kind of position itself in this impossible place, right? So that we can look upon something that we've experienced before with a new perspective, or new information, new language, right? The poem is supposed to make things new, and so that's kind of where my head is at with this. And so I'm a writer, and writers write. We don't talk that much, so I'm going to read from my actual remarks usually. I would riff, but then I would probably ramble. So let's see. I'm going to start with a quote. So Seneca's scholar John Mohawk, in his book Utopian Legacies, wrote, "The pursuit of utopian goals requires resources, both material and non-material, and its achievement is such a splendid objective that its followers are inclined to believe nothing should stand in the way of securing those resources. Whatever the utopian justification, the practice of acquiring these resources by force or other forms of coercion is simply the act of plunder. Utopian ideologies enable plunderers to claim, even to believe, that they are in pursuit of noble goals. There is no doubt that people are capable of embracing an imaginary perfect world while pursuing materialistic objectives. In such a pursuit, it is important to note that the utopian vision is the primary goal, while plunder, although attractive, is a secondary objective," end quote. And so I chose Hearts and Minds because I feel like it best represents some of the ideas in this quote, and then also my ideas in terms of the poem sort of slicing through, or kind of sitting in the middle of a binary. And so the phrase "winning hearts and minds," used by U.S. President Lyndon Johnson, suggested that in order to win the Vietnam War, the United States of America had to win the hearts and minds of the Vietnamese people, which the reader can glean from the first stanza, consisting of 8 lines, that the goal of spreading democracy required subjugation and systematic violence of the Vietnamese people in order to spread Western democracy, right? So this sort of ironic thing, right? So we're going to free you by, murdering you. I can't quite ever get over that sort of complexity when I think about why wars are waged. So just kind of going back to it here. Let's see. Ironic, the spreading of democracy, the peace and freedom required razing of villages, the murder of children, and the disruption of a culture, which was not lost on T.C. Cannon, who was at the time serving in the war as a airborne ranger. At the time he wrote this incisive critique of colonial conquest. It's important to note that Cannon focuses on the mothers who are often tasked with restoring some form of cultural continuity after the colonists have taken their utopian ideologies elsewhere. As the privilege is given to the mothers, we find that Cannon acknowledges those often forgotten in conflicts. How do mothers still raise their sons and daughters? How do they teach them to plant rice, in quote, on the scorched land? How do these mothers heal the psychological harm that comes with the violent distraction or disruption of culture? We then transition to the second stanza, and to a sort of a reference to the U.S. culture and the American people at that particular time, and also with sort of Cannon implicating himself in the violence, right? And so I really enjoyed how he sort of conflated the soldiers with the mothers, because in some ways the soldiers themselves are, in a sense, victims, right, of a system and an ideology, right? They're following orders. And I like this idea that he can sort of say that we're all victims and we also are all to blame at the same time, which I think is an incredibly difficult thing to do in a poem. But I think he does it really well. Through this poem, Cannon attempted to conflate the colonial experience of the Vietnamese people, which consisted of systematic violence inflicted by the French United States, with the colonial experience of the indigenous people of the Americas, which we can see in the phrase immigrant land of buffalo and potato. I think as a Native person, he's one of the only people that could actually have written this poem at the time to understand that the people that essentially he was tasked with subjugating in a way, right? I think that, as a Native person and having that sort of sense of that history of violence, those types of things, he really had a sense of empathy and understood the conflict in a completely different way compared to, I think, what most of us, well, I wasn't alive at the time, but what most people were probably exposed to on the national media and things like that. And so, so that's kind of where I stand with his, with a lot of the poems that he wrote, and also with his philosophies and positions on Native American art and identity. And I think that, for me, those are the type of places that I always want to get to in a poem. That's the type of territory that I want to reach. I don't want to necessarily enact resistance in poems, but I want people to understand and see themselves in that work. And I think that Cannon does that very well. Thank you.
All right. And now William S. Yellowrobe Jr. William S. Yellowrobe Jr. is an Assiniboine playwright. He is a recipient of the Lifetime Achievement Award from Native Writers Circle of the Americas. 3 new poems are to be published in the new edition of the Dawnland Voices, and a new collection of his plays entitled Restless Spirits, plays by William S. Yellowrobe Jr., edited by Jace Weaver, scheduled to be released this year. His play, Macon Indixons, was one of 5 newly completed one-act plays and was published in the America's Best One-Act Plays. Other publications of his work include Grandchildren of the Buffalo Soldiers and Other Untold Stories, a collection of his full-length plays, Where the Pavement Ends, New Native Drama, a collection of his one-act plays. He is a member of the Ensemble Studio Theater and Penumbra Theater. Yellowrobe resides in Maine, where he is a Libra professor at the English department at the University of Maine.
Can you hear me? Yes. I'm using my intertribal council voice. So in case a fight breaks out, I still can be heard. I'm not great with working with microphones, so I hope this is not insulting to you. I am Assiniboine, Nakota, from the Fort Peck Indian Reservation. It is an honor to be in the homeland of the Wampanoag or Wampanoag, as they're pronounced, depending on what clan you're talking to. It's an honor to celebrate the work of T.C. Cannon. The poem I chose is poem number 2, Beef Issue. This is a very important issue because it was also a reflection of my people. We who lived on bison had a great transition within our identity when our food was changed from bison to cattle. Culture changed with the breed of the cattle. Also, what people don't understand environmentally, when cattle were brought into the United States, it brought about eco-genocide. Many of the indigenous creatures were hunted down and basically wiped out, like the bison, elk, deer. In fact, right now in Montana, there's a huge fight to keep the bison herd in Yellowstone alive because the Cattlemen's Association believe the bison herd contains a disease that will attack their cattle. So it's an ongoing issue, and there's also an issue about the migration of elk. And that's my environmental plug for this afternoon. Thank you. Let me read this poem to you. Everything must be used. Then else return to the earth. For even now, the grass is black with blood. The rain survival. It was that whole issue of adopting new ways to live. It's amazing to me that when I remember as a young man hunting, our whole family hunted. And there were rituals that had to be performed, the sacredness, because this animal is giving you your life. But did you take those same type of rituals and apply that to the butchering of a cow? Something very foreign to Native people. It's the same thing with education and the arts. The arts are very much a colonial art form introduced to Native people, just as poetry and painting is to some tribes. In fact, when I was teaching at the Institute of American Indian Arts, I was reminded by our academic dean, Roger Buffalohead, that art is a word that does not exist in all Native tribes within their languages. Art is defined much differently, just as poetry. But what really strikes me about T.C. Cannon's work is the subtlety of this. When you have a ritual, there's an intimacy among the people and the individual that sacrificed their life. There's an intimacy. But having the soldiers there with their fuzzy face breaks up that intimacy. It breaks up that sincerity. And no, it sounds kind of perverse, but it breaks up that love. That intimate bond of man and animal, of the environment. It breaks up the history of people and their relationship to the environment and to their rituals, to their identity. Most importantly, the reason why I love T.C. Cannon's work, especially this poem, it shows that even though you go through genocide, you have the elements of survival, but you keep your rituals. Because when you start blending those rituals with survival, you achieve the ultimate goal of oppression. The ultimate goal to defeat oppression, which is you learn how to live. And even though there's black blood on the ground, it's a reminder of the legacy of all those who came before us, who sacrificed themselves so we can be alive. So for Mr. T.C. Cannon, Kanamia, in my language, thank you for bringing this art to this world and into this art.
Okay. So we have a few minutes for some questions here. And so the first question that I would like to ask is for Dorothy Wang. What potential does Cannon's poetry offer to enhance social cultural awareness in a society that is largely and sometimes willfully unaware?
Hello? That's a giant question. Wait, can you repeat it again? I'm sorry.
Yeah, what potential does Cannon's poetry offer to enhance social cultural awareness amidst a society that is largely, sometimes willfully unaware?
Well, I think it's significant that he actually brings up issues that are either seen as taboo. Can people hear me? Seen as taboo, or issues of history, say around war, or what William was talking about around the replacement of buffalo by cattle. Those, even bringing up those themes is a kind of rebuff to the erasure of history and the tendency towards amnesia. And I think the sort of domain, as I said earlier, the domain of poetry is usually seen as kind of personal, private, meditative, not the realm of war or politics or big social issues. And I think that alone, it's very important that he brings that in with a lyric sensibility. It's not propaganda. He's doing it in a poetic way. So I think that alone is important.
Thank you. T.C. Cannon said, "I give all the truth I have to the world of painting. I save all of my bitter deceit for the poetry." So, Matt, this question is for you. How do the truths of painting complement the deceit of his poetry, since they're meant to work together?
I'm just gonna like really vulgarly, is that a word? Deflect this question, and ask my co-panelists to join me in answering it, because I mean I honestly don't understand the difference between honesty and deceit, but I know that Cannon must have been thinking about something particular when he said that, and I mean deceit seems like quite obvious to me. It seems like the basis of all poetry, and potentially, I mean, as a sort of political relation, it makes more sense to me. So I just wonder, as we're thinking about the paintings of poems together, how we are thinking about that opposition between honesty and deceit.
Sure.
We
William will
discussed this issue in native theater, the concept that we deal with, and it appears a lot in prayer. Sincerity is the belief of what you're doing. It's the honesty of what you're doing. In theater, they call it plausibility. In native theater, we call it sincerity. You have to believe in what you do. You have to believe the world that you're creating on stage. You have to believe in this ritual. You have to believe in these words that you're saying as a character. So it becomes dishonest when you get into histrionics, when you fake something. And I think that's the interesting thing. It's like cultural appropriation. You fake an identity, which is fake. Whereas T.C. Cannon is very real. You can't escape the fact he's a native person. But it's because of that strong culture, that strong foothold. He has such honesty, and it appeals to everybody because it's so raw and so clean. There's no histrionics, there's no facade as to what he's doing and what he's talking about. And the poetry, as far as bitterness, every artist that I've talked with, because I used to teach at IIA, we had students who did wonderful poems, but were phenomenal painters, like Bunky Echohawk. He's a tremendous painter, but he's also truly an incredible poet as well.
Thank you. So many of Cannon's poems read as if they were happening simultaneously between the past and the present, as if the two overlapped. So, Melanie, what is the purpose of creating this overlap? And you and Santee can both answer to this. I'll ask you both.
Just bought myself like 10 seconds. I don't think this is either. Well, okay. So I feel very tempted to invoke Faulkner here. I mean, the very famous quote, "The past is never dead, it's not even past." And I mean, I think that applies, and I'm not trying to force the Southern and the Native together again. Obviously, that seems to be my shtick. But I think, it's important because that, to me, is the sort of compatible geography of loss and dispossession that binds the experience of people like Southerners and like Indigenous Americans and so many others. It doesn't stop there. I think we're history-haunted people. And in one way that sounds so obvious it doesn't really bear saying. But I think it's work like Cannon's that helps us to feel what that really means to walk around in the world as Quentin Compson would say, a barracks of ghosts, a sort of mausoleum of all the people that came before. So, yeah, I mean, I think I'll just leave it at that.
I think one of the main things that I feel like that I'm up against is an entire sort of historical record that defines me as a native artist before I'm even born, right? Like there's these definitions, there are these master narratives, there are these things that you're constantly trying to fight because, for one, they're dehumanizing. Two, there's this sort of sense of that the United States or what is considered to be the United States now was this sort of blank slate where we all lived in teepees and all of these other things, which some people did, but that didn't apply to all Native people. And I think that one of the jobs as an artist is to make sure that they're representing their people in an ethical sort of way. And I think I think those things can also be represented in contemporary times as well, right? And I think that, again, T.C. Cannon was really good at that. If you look at some of the portraits and things like that, you'll notice this sort of, for lack of a better word, stoicism, but you also notice some of the humor in some of the positions and how he's kind of, in some ways, making fun of, those poses and things like that of the past. And I think in a way it's trying to, or at least he was trying to, update those definitions and those master narratives in terms of, how natives are defined and how Native people exist in the sort of prevailing American consciousness. Does that work?
Thank you. Overall, Cannon's poetry, coupled with his paintings, seems to suggest a reclamation and a kind of sense of salvation. So this question is for Matt and William again. Does he use a kind of redemptive language in his poetry to express these sentiments? And if so, what kind of vocabulary is he using in his poetry?
I guess I'll answer briefly, and again, I think we could maybe all answer this question. But I think that I'm pretty suspicious or reluctant to engage in like a reading toward redemption. Not that that's necessarily a bad idea, but I thinking about utopia as this kind of inherently plunderous project, and I think it bears on some of the conversations that were happening this morning around canon making and how we want to rethink like the American visual and literary arts canon. And I think whatever we want to say about redemption, I don't think that entering the canon or inclusion in the canon is a redemptive project, yet nonetheless, the form of the canon is the thing that creates a binary where you're in or out. And so that it traps you into thinking that inclusion will become redemptive. So I think the challenge in some sense is to like open up the space outside of in or out or redemptive or unredeemed in this like moment, the impossible place, right? I think rather than to rather to have recourse to kind of like a defensive or morally pure stance, like what would it mean to like love the impossible place? Like what does it mean to love the unredeemed? I mean, I think that's the thing that I take away from Cannon's work, and I think it's like an ongoing project.
I don't really admire the word redemption because it's almost like Matt says, it's a redeeming, but in whose eyes? By whose conventions and whose concepts? I find it interesting in Native theater that we try to pursue that idea of what is a Native voice. And there's so much literature about Native people by non-Natives that we assume that this is a representation of us. It's amazing that W.P. Kinsella wrote all these books in Canada, Dance Me Outside, Scars, and everybody was using these books. And they're written by a man who hates Native people, which I find ironic. For me, myself, that whole thing of history, it's amazing to me because I don't have the privilege of enjoying white privilege or white conventions because I'm part black. So I saw inhumanity on both sides on the reservation. On one side, I'm a nigger. On the other side, I'm a dirty Indian. But I never had white privilege that I could go run and say, oh, I'm white now. I'm redeemed. I dump my white culture aside, or my Indian culture aside, and I'm redeemed. And I saw that religiously on the reservation where we have Native people who become, through Christianity, the minstrel shows, the ministers coming through, where they'll burn everything. And this is a way of redeeming themselves in the eye of God, but also politically and socially, it's amazing as to how you try to establish a cleansing of yourself, of your identity, for who? Because one of the things I always tell the story is that it wasn't so much an becoming an Indian, universally through rituals, it was a question of becoming a human being in the universe. It was achieving that consciousness of raising yourself beyond the pettiness that human beings have. So it's not so much a redemption, it's almost a discovery of who you are, of your consciousness.
Right, just one closing question. So, is there a way to bring Cannon's work from the edge of America into broader recognition for a greater audience that can appreciate him? And this is really for any of you who would like to answer. Yeah, is there a way to bring Cannon's poetry from the edge of America into a broader recognition for a greater audience?
Well, I feel so political. I'm one of those elders where you guys shut up once in a while. Well, anyway, what needs to happen, there has to be more publishing of native work. Because one of the things that has happened, I was amazed by the First Nations of Canada. They were publishing indigenous work left and right, but here in America, it's so hard for Native people to have their work published. And to get it out there, I've submitted to the Dramatist Source Book, other dramatic publications, and they tell me outright, it's a great play, but we have no market for your work, so we can't publish it. And all three publications I'm having of my work are through academic presses. And I'm not reaping the benefits of a commercial writer, like a commercial white writer. In order for TC to survive, what has to happen within the Native, in America, is to start recognizing Native people are more than just Indians. That we are individual sovereign nations with many different languages, many different cultures. And there's nothing wrong with that because you do it in Europe. You do it in Africa. You do it in China. Why can't it be done here in America? Why can't we honor the indigenous nations like we do in Europe, the other indigenous nations of Europe? And I think that's the reason why I say it's political, because in order for that to change, in order to get TC out there and into schoolrooms, we have to change the mindset of what it is to be Native American in America.
Thank you. That's all the time we have for right now. Thank you, panelists, for sharing. Thank you.